The terminal hummed like a living thing. Wheels on tile, the soft rumble of distant announcement speakers, the thin clink of luggage tags. People moved in predictable streams, business suits, backpack straps, a child tugging at a parent. It was an ordinary Thursday until Rex decided it wasn't. One moment, the carousel spat out a plain gray suitcase and a man in a navy coat reached to claim it. The next, a sound cut through the background noise like a dropped tray, a low, urgent bark that pulled eyes. Rex lunged. Not a polite sniff or a practiced sit commanding attention. He flew forward on his handler's command and sank his jaws over the hard shell. The dog did not bite to injure. He bit and held, muzzle clenched, muscles taut as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. His growl vibrated through the metal casing, and the air around him seemed to tilt. Silence fell like a curtain. A woman knocked her coffee. A brown wave spilled across tile. A stroller screeched to a halt. Announcements stuttered, and the lights over the carousel flickered until, in the sudden quiet, Rex's breath and the conveyor's slow thrum were the only steady sounds. His leash tightened against Daniel's gloved hand, and for a moment the handler and the dog were a single, unyielding line of intent. People stepped back. Security barriers were pulled into place before the words even left mouths. The badge-wearing officers on duty moved with rehearsed precision. Cordon off, clear the area, call the bomb squad. But Daniel felt the room differently. He felt Rex's insistence, not drama, not performance, but a signal honed by years of training and countless hours of search and obedience. A machine might read density or density variations. Rex read history in the way a scent adhered to a zipper or nested in a seam. He'd never felt Rex hold onto any piece of inanimate object like that. "Stand clear," called Officer Ramirez, voice clipped. Phones were raised instinctively, faces lit by tiny screens as the crowd recorded. An airport worker steadied a small child at the edge of the perimeter. Daniel's face stayed calm. He spoke to Rex rather than to anyone else. "Easy, boy. Easy." The man who claimed the bag, Adrian, was ushered forward by two officers. He was 30-something, his eyes rimmed and unfocused as if sleep had been a stranger for weeks. He kept saying the same thing in different cadences. "I don't know anything. I was told to pick this up, I swear, please." His hands were clean, his pockets were empty. He flinched when passengers glared. He flinched harder when Rex bared his teeth. Daniel watched Adrian as much as he watched the dog. A handler learns to read people the way K9s read objects, micro-movements, micro-hesitations. Adrian's story hung unsteady, like a picture barely affixed to a wall. He was the kind of person a city might use and then forget. A courier in the gray economy, a face that could fit 100 profiles. He had a way of looking at his hands that suggested they had been told to do things they did not want to do. "We've cleared the carousel," Officer Carter announced into a radio. "Bomb squad en route, keep the crowd back." Someone had already pushed the emergency stop on the conveyor. The belt came to a soft halt with a mechanical sigh, and suddenly the scene felt surgical. An operating theater with a single stubborn organ at its center. The K9 unit did its job by making the problem undeniable. It was now everyone else's job to prove what Rex was insisting on. If this is pulling you in, hit like and subscribe. There's more coming after the next scene. The bomb squad arrived in a black van that moved with practiced calm. Technicians stepping out with tool cases and heads of concentration. They did what bomb squads do, set up a secondary perimeter, scan from a distance, review images. Their scanners hummed. Small screens showed nothing explosively alarming, only shadow and density. The machines were designed to find specific signatures. Metal in the wrong place, the telltale geometry of something built to harm. The suitcase on the screens was just a suitcase. "Thermal is clean," the lead technician said, not unkindly. No heat signatures, no dense packing indicating a detonation device. X-rays inconclusive. Could be benign, could be gas canisters, could be wiring. We're being cautious. Cautious was a neat word. Daniel kept one hand on Rex's harness and the other hovering near the zipper where the dog gripped. He could smell the trace of the airport, a mash of fast food, jet fuel, and lemon cleaner. but under it was an undercurrent that made his jaw tighten, a faint chemical tang that didn't belong to packing tape or fabric. It was the sort of scent the nose of a trained dog could pick out before a machine registered a polygon of concern. He remembered the missions that trained him to trust the instincts that moved when he could not see the cause. This wasn't reflex. It was history aligning with the present. "Rex is holding," Daniel reported quietly, more to himself than to anyone. "He's not letting go. He's not reacting as if it's a threat to people. He's guarding." To the technicians, guarding meant something different. It was protocol to render the object inert by disposal or controlled detonation if there had been any sign of threat. But a guarded object could also be evidence, something to be protected. The difference matters when the thing inside is not a bomb, but a carefully constructed secret. "Can you move him?" Carter asked, glancing at the dog. Daniel looked at Rex and found no sun seal of aggression, only focus. "No, not yet. He won't let it go." The technicians exchanged that look readers of police dramas know well, a negotiation between the book and the animal. "We can move to remote opening," the lead said. "Robotic manipulator, minimize risk." Daniel shook his head. He had to explain, and in his voice there was no improvisation. "Rex is telling us something machines can't. We need to see it. We open slow, by hand. If I can keep him calm, we can preserve." "Preserve what?" the lead asked, not unkind. "Evidence, or the dog's safety?" "Both." Daniel's hand tightened on Rex's harness. "You can treat it like a bomb if you want, or you can treat it like a crime scene, but if you use the manipulator, you could destroy what the dog is holding. Let me try, with a protocol team behind me." The decision sat in the air, heavy and half-formed. The squad could push for a fail-safe approach. Daniel could argue for a handler's intuition that had saved more than one lead from being lost to an overzealous robot. In the end, it was two small things that tipped the balance: Rex's refusal to release and the way Adrian's face fell when a technician mentioned demolition. Fear makes people tell the truth by accident. Adrian's reaction was a non-verbal sentence. "Fine," the lead conceded through a thin breath. "We open under controlled conditions, gloves, documentation, cameras on, chain of custody. You're on lead." The handlers longed for that phrase. "The handler is on lead," because it guaranteed the dog's presence would be honored. Daniel positioned himself to the side, formed a thin barrier with his body between Rex and the suitcase, and allowed the handler's ritual to begin. Gloves were layered, a plastic evidence mat placed beneath the bag, crime scene markers arranged like a calm chorus. Cameras recorded. Radios whispered coordinates to headquarters as if they were actors in a play who had just been told the scene would run a few more minutes. Rex's jaw was steady as a vice. His eyes were focused and mechanical in that canine way that suggested concentration without intention. He grunted once when they eased him back, and Daniel felt every muscle in the dog's neck flex under his palm. The zipper was warm from the dog's breath. "Slow," Daniel whispered to the technician who had a utility knife drawn like a scalpel. The knife made a careful cut at the seam of fabric, as much to honor the dog's hold as to open the case. Each inch opened like a small fluorescent disaster. The first layer revealed nothing explosive. The inside of the suitcase was dense with custom packing, foam inserts, an inner tray. The feel of it was wrong, too tidy, as if someone had thought about how it would look under scrutiny. The inner tray clicked when they lifted it, and beneath that, unseen until the light hit a certain angle, a seam of metal glinted. They peeled the metal back like a bandage, and the room's temperature shifted. Inside was a cavity as precise as a watch case. Within it sat leather envelopes, stacks of passports in different names, and a set of sealed, vacuum-packed pads. Small cloth squares stained dark as if with oil. They weren't anything like explosives. They were something more insidious. The tools of movement without trace. "Passports," Carter said, voice low. "Multiple nationalities. Blank visas, forged seals maybe." Gloves moved faster. A passport was lifted, opened. Photographs smiled back, faces that could belong to thousands of men. The pages had been worked with an artisan's touch, laminate seams rebonded, stamps insinuated in the right places. For a moment the room tasted like fraud, a bureaucracy rewritten by someone who cared about details. The pads were labeled only by worn ink, forgeries in the service of disguise. No machine had called any of this a threat. No censor had flagged a forged stamp or a scent pad soaked in false identity. But here, in a small rectangle of metal in a gray suitcase, lay the architecture of a network that moved people by erasing the lines between them. Adrian's voice trembled when he heard passports named. "I swear, I didn't," he started. He stumbled through the same defense, but his shoulders had already folded into the hint of cooperation. They read out one name, then another, and unspooled a series of contradictions from Adrian that widened like a slow tear. He had been given money, said he had been told to get the bag to a woman at gate C12, that he had been instructed never to look inside. He repeated what he'd been told with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed fear. Daniel watched Adrian's mouth move and felt the old knot of the missing handler on his chest loosen a notch and tighten again. He had known John Hale, the man who had been the kind of officer you read about in memorials and in small-town regret. John had a canine, Shadow, a dog that moved with a calmer intensity than Rex, but carried the same absolute commitment. John had gone missing a year earlier during an investigation that had never quite fit the boxes. The case had grown cold as lead in a river. Daniel had kept a photo of John on his locker shelf, the two of them at a regional seminar, smiling despite the dust of decades of service. He had never stopped thinking about the last line in John's file. Following an international route, possible trafficking link. Now a folder of passports sat under fluorescent lights, and a name Daniel had seen in John's notes surfaced like a ghost from paper. There was no direct line yet, only a direction as faint and urgent as a sniff in the dark. The loose thread smelled like John's work. "Log everything," the lead technician ordered. "Every item, every placement. Chain of custody starts now. Tag the bag." They moved like a team who had practiced for situations that were never quite like this. Gloves, evidence tags, a black stick-on label slapped onto the shell where Rex had bitten. Someone wrote a bag number in tidy permanent marker. Photos were taken from angles that showed the dog's teeth marks, the metal seam, the way the passports had been stowed. Forensics didn't just collect. They reified truth into objects the system could touch without being tricked by a dog's urge. When the leather envelope was peeled back, one of the smaller packets shifted and spilled, and inside it was a sight that narrowed Daniel's throat. An evidence kit the color of old vinyl, the kind used by handlers in past years to log scent samples. The kit had a name tag stitched inside the flap. Daniel's fingers were steadier than his mind as he read the tiny, faded type. John Hale. He felt his heartbeat in the heel of his hand. Rex's grip loosened a fraction, as if his hold had changed from guarding to pointing. The dog nosed at the kit, then pushed his head into Daniel's hand with that blunt, grave affection that only dogs can give. The motion was an insistence that something had been found that belonged to a story that had not yet closed. "Is that?" Carter's question hung unfinished. "Yeah," Daniel said. The word was small, but it carried a year's worth of missing nights and folders that never quite closed. He slid the kit onto the evidence mat with gloves, careful to keep the chain intact. Inside the kit were the sorts of things handlers used to collect scent samples: small vials, sealed envelopes, a folded card with looped handwriting. There were no dramatic revelations in those items. They were ordinary tools, personal objects that anchored a man to the work he had been doing. They found a dog tag tucked in a pocket, the metal dulled with use and carrying only one name, one number. Daniel's breath hitched. He had seen that tag on a photograph taped to his locker. He had seen it on a missing person report that had never stopped spinning in his head. He cradled the tag like a relic and realized the room had acquired a new gravity. Where there had been mystery, there was now a breadcrumb the size of a man's life. "Someone put his kid in here," Carter said. No accusation, only the observation. It was forensic truth, not storyline. Adrian's brows knit. "I was told to pick up the case," he said again. "I swear I didn't open it. I didn't know." He gestured at the items as if they were a trap set by someone else. His voice was a paper boat in a storm. The presence of John's kit reframed everything. It turned a suspicious bag into a possible continuation of a case that had never been solved. It turned a canine insistence into a threaded line that might connect an anonymous courier to a network with names, routes, and, if they found everything, answers. Daniel felt the old case's dossier press against his ribs. He thought of Shadow and of John's voice on training field days, the way he explained the subtle art of following a scent trail. There was a note in John's file that haunted Daniel. A last scrawl about routes, a few shorthand references that had never become useful because they were missing context. Now some of that context might be sitting under fluorescent light in a room full of cables and cameras. But the suitcase still had one more hold, an interior capsule that rattled faintly when tilted, a slot the size of a thumb tucked into the lining. Someone's fingers years ago had hidden something small and flat in that slot and then sealed it into silence. The lead technician lifted the frame to inspect, and a shadow crossed his face. "There's a hidden slot," he said. "Could be data, could be anything," the lead finished. Everyone knew what that meant. Data changed investigations in the modern world. A single thumb drive might open a city of secrets if it wasn't brick-walled behind encryption or proprietary obfuscation. It might also contain nothing but music, but no one wanted to risk treating it as disposable. Daniel's hands hovered over the slot but did not reach in. He felt a strange, involuntary respect for the moment. The dog had bitten the suitcase because something inside mattered beyond the kinetic of a detection routine. The dog had bitten because, in his nose and in his training, he had found an echo of something that had ended in a man's disappearance. "Let's bag it," Carter suggested. "Tag it, secure it for analysis." They bagged the slot with a small, clear envelope, sealing it, labeling it, and placing it on the evidence mat like a promise. Cameras captured every angle as if to translate the physical into records that could be shared without letting the intangible leak away. Adrian was placed into a holding area, his posture folding into a shape that meant cooperation, or exhaustion. Officials began the necessary motions of information gathering, statements, names, contact numbers, the slow ritual of turning people into files. Daniel couldn't bring himself to step away. He kept Rex close, feeling the dog's body rhythm against his leg, a continuity he had come to rely on. Shadow's memory tugged at him, not like grief, but like an unfinished sentence waiting for punctuation. He reached inside his pocket and touched the edges of a folded photograph he kept from John's memorial fund, an old training day shot, and breathed the way a man measures his past. "Listen," the lead technician said into his radio, voice brusque now that the immediacy had passed. "We need forensics to come down from the regional office. We'll need to transport this to a controlled lab, and given the kit with a missing handler's name, I'm going to recommend federal notification." The word federal landed like a small explosion. It meant a new set of hands and new eyes, and the possibility of moving the case beyond airport jurisdiction into a larger frame. It meant agents who could cross borders on paper and subpoena servers rather than mere wallets. It also meant the risk that the discovery might become something bigger than anything Daniel had intended when he leaned on Rex's harness and trusted the dog to tell him what the scanner could not. Adrian watched all of this with the sort of hollow focus that said his life had just been moved into a room that would interrogate every choice he'd made. He looked like someone who had been told to carry a box and had not imagined the consequences of its opening. He had a child's fear of punishment and an adult's fear of exposure. Someone offered him a chair. He lowered himself like a man who had been told to wait for a sentence. "You're sure this is—" Carter began, but the lead cut him off with a nod. "Chain it to a lab," he said. "Don't touch the drive yet. Let federal forensics handle the data. Secure the passport samples. This is more than regional." Daniel slid the dog tag from John's kit into his gloved palm and felt the dull weight of the metal. He thought, not for the first time, about the way justice sometimes had to wait for chance meetings. A dog choosing a bag, an officer with enough faith in the animal to resist a manipulator, a courier too weary to lie consistently. He thought of John's handwriting in the old file, of initials that had been jotted down with the kind of insistence you get when you're running out of time. Someone called in a transport. Radios crackled with a dozen small tasks. The crowd beyond the perimeter had thinned, and the normal liturgy of travel resumed around them. Flight announcements, a delayed departure, the clink of an espresso machine at the cafe. But inside the cordon the world had narrowed to a handful of objects, and the weight of a missing man. "Daniel," Carter said quietly. "You okay?" He looked down at Rex. The dog had shifted once to press his flank to Daniel, and then settled back to attention. His teeth had left a small crescent mark on the shell of the suitcase. It would be part of the record now. Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. "Yeah," he said. "Just keep him close. I want to be there when they seal the kit." They did not open the sealed slot. They did not insert drives into lab machines. The room did what law enforcement does in the early hours of a promising case. It collected, it documented, it refused to act rashly until the analytical partners could take over. Evidence was bagged, numbers were logged, and the air filled with a low kind of business like bees in a hive. Even in the careful choreography, small things matter. A technician photographed the dog tag. Someone else thumbed through the passports for overstamps that didn't match. Adrian answered the same questions again, as if the act of answering would exhale whatever had been told to him by those who had given him the bag. Daniel observed, cataloging reactions like a second set of eyes. He kept thinking about the way Rex had guarded the case. Why that particular suitcase? Why that particular day? It was the kind of question that might have nothing to do with the missing man, and everything to do with the logistics of the smuggling network that had harnessed fear and routine as its tools. By the time a gray sedan pulled into the lot, marked in a generic way that still carried the authority of larger jurisdiction, the airport team had already done the hard work of making the unknown legible. Two agents in plain coats stepped out and moved with the restraint of people who have to convince others to be patient. They were supplemented by a small, unmarked van of specialists who carried laptops and the kind of technical equipment that translated physical objects into digital leads. The lead agent, a woman with an efficient haircut and a voice that measured facts the way a surgeon measures incisions, pulled Daniel aside for a word. She didn't ask questions in the accusatory style of television interrogators. She asked in the way of someone who wanted to know what the dog felt. "So, your dog bit the suitcase," she said simply. "You could say he flagged it," Daniel replied. "He didn't bark and run, he bit and held, he was guarding it. When we opened it, we found passports, scent pads, and an evidence kit with John Hale's name." The agent's face registered a flash of something. Concern, recognition, the cold spark of a puzzle piece locking. "John Hale?" she repeated. "We have his file here. We've been looking at his missing person file for months. We were pushing the case to a federal list but couldn't anchor a lead." Daniel felt his mouth go dry. The same file had sat on his locker shelf, a kind of quiet accusation that sometimes blunted the days. "We have the kit," he said. "We're sealing it for your lab. There was a slot for a drive. It's bagged." "Good," she said. She turned then, and in that pivot the scene shifted into the next phase. Calls were made, names exchanged, an entire apparatus started to rotate toward a single axis, a suitcase bitten by a dog at an airport. Daniel watched as the network he had relied on for years began to line up like dominoes. He felt both the smallness of his role and the magnitude of what had been pulled into the light. Rex leaned his head against Daniel's knee and exhaled, a long, contented breath, as if a found object allowed him to relax. Daniel stroked the dog's flank and thought of John and Shadow, and of the countless handlers who had trusted instincts and paid for it. He thought of the man Adrien, still in a chair, repeating the story about being told to pick up a bag, terrified that in answering he might betray those who had told him. He thought of the passports, of the smell of the scent pads, and of the quiet metal of a dog tag that seemed like a small piece of a larger puzzle. Outside of the cordon, announcements resumed their indifferent choreography. People surveyed the delay and sighed. Travel is a procession of inconveniences. But within the perimeter, within the careful grid of tape and cameras, A story had begun to reassemble itself from shards, postal routes, forged identities, human couriers who carried secrets like luggage. The bite on the suitcase had been the first audible note in a song whose melody had been lost. They loaded the sealed items into labeled coolers and carried them toward the unmarked vans. Someone checked the gloves. Someone photographed hands. The evidence mat, now crowded with tags and tape, folded up like a map of where the story had bent. Daniel kept one hand on Rex until the kits were out of sight, as if the dog's presence could keep the narrative from breaking apart. As the transport vehicles rolled away, the lead agent looked at Daniel and said, "More to fill the small human space where bureaucratic motion sometimes sounds inhuman. Thank you. The dog did good work." "It was him," Daniel said, fingers tightening once on the tag he had not yet let go of. "It was Rex." They spoke no more, and yet the exchange held more than the words suggested. A simple gratitude that acknowledged the oddity of how cases unspooled, sometimes through databases and subpoenas, sometimes through the blunt, reliable force of a dog's jaw. Daniel watched the vans disappear into a line of traffic that would take the case away from the fluorescent security lights and into labs and offices where analysts would try to translate the physical truths into warrants and wire orders. For now, for the slow hour after the vans left, the terminal seemed to breathe again. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that some of his past had been tugged into motion. He thought of John's handwriting, the faint scrawl in the old file that had made his chest ache with questions, and of the way a dog's insistence could reroute an investigation that had once been static. He thought about the thinness of time, and how one moment, one bite, could become a hinge on which justice might pivot. They cleared the scene with efficiency born of routine. Passengers told someone else why their flights were delayed. Businesses calculated lost espresso sales in small notches. But in the small, stilled space where the suitcase had lived, a different accounting began. Inventories to file, interviews to schedule, and an investigator in a plain coat who had told Daniel to expect a call. Daniel patted Rex's flank, feeling each rib under his palm as if to reassure himself that the dog was whole and that the world fit back into its seams. He slid the photograph of John from his pocket and set it beside the now empty spot on the evidence mat where the kit had sat. The image looked smaller than the memory. He rubbed the metal dog tag between his fingers one last time, feeling the small dent where Shadow's collar might once have pressed it. The tag warmed with his touch and then cooled again. They had not solved anything yet. They had only found a thread. But a thread is sometimes enough to begin the unraveling of an entire garment. As transport vehicles carried the items away, the lead agent made a note in a small book and said aloud, "We'll analyze, cross-reference, and get back to you." This could be huge. Daniel watched her lips form the word, could, and felt both the weight of possibility and the patience of procedure. He knew the world moved in coulds and maybes, and that some coulds never became cans. But he also knew Rex had bitten for a reason, sharp and direct, and that reason had deposited in their hands the things that might finally pull John's case from cold into motion. They gathered their gear. The airport reopened to the indifferent flow of travelers. Daniel clipped Rex into his transport crate and walked him toward their van. He did not say anything. Dog and handler often communicate in silences. His mind churned with the list of things to do: give a formal statement, meet the federal agents, sign off on the chain of custody logs, and, if opportunity allowed, read the notebook in John's kit. He wanted to see John's handwriting again, to trace the stops John had made with a finger, like a man following a map he had once drawn. As he walked, the photograph of John slid from his pocket and caught on the edge of the evidence table. It fluttered and landed face up near the tag still left under the protective camera. For a second, in a room returning to its normal electric breath, the image of John and his K9 looked back at them, a line between past and present they had not yet closed. The call that would set the next stage had not yet come, and the drive that might hold a master map of the network remained a sealed secret inside a bag. But the dog's jaw had been the opening. The rest, analysis, cross-referencing, federal involvement, would follow, a slow architecture of work that would take them from fluorescent lights to laboratories, from paper to servers, from an airport terminal to raids and interrogations, and maybe finally, resolution. For the moment, the question the title posed, what happened when a police dog bit a suitcase at the airport, had an answer that was equal parts literal and symbolic. The dog had found what machines had missed. He had guarded something that carried evidence of a world built to move people and erase them at the same time. He had bitten not just a case, but a chapter of a cold file, and in doing so had forced the authorities to open a box they'd hoped would stay closed. Daniel closed the van's rear door with a hand that still smelled faintly of airport coffee and antiseptic. He watched Rex settle on the crate, head on pause, eyes tracking the people moving through the terminal with a soldier's interest. He thought of the lab technicians who would later call him for more details, and of the federal agents who would make decisions he would not be part of. He thought of John's dog tag still warm in his pocket, and wondered what the notebook's pages, still sealed in a photographer's protective sleeve, might finally reveal. They drove back to the precinct under streetlights that blurred into streaks. The city held its routine, someone walking a dog, someone else checking a text. But Daniel felt like a man who had just been given permission to believe that a long, unsolved ache might have been nudged in the right direction. He did not know yet whether the discovery would change everything, or merely nudge an old file into a new box, but he could not unfeel the significance of the moment. A million tiny decisions condensed into an instant. A canine jaw closing on a small gray suitcase and refusing to let it go. They drove back under a sky smeared with sodium light. The city slid past in ribbons, stoplights, storefronts, a late-night diner steaming under a neon halo. Daniel watched the road, but his mind kept returning to the small, precise objects that had left the terminal. A dog tag, a stitched evidence kit, a sealed clear envelope holding a slot-sized secret. Rex lay with his head on his paws and watched the night the way soldiers do, alert but trying to rest. Daniel felt like him, alert, not asleep. At the precinct, the van doors opened with that familiar click of a place that knows its business. They moved the coolers into the forensics bay with the same care they'd used at the airport. Gloves, tags, more photographs than felt necessary until you remembered why nothing could be lost to chance. The sealed slot went into a tamper-evident box. The evidence mat, now a folded map of small facts, went into a locker. Each tag and number slid into a ledger that could carry the story forward without distortion. It should have felt like the end of something. Instead, it felt like the hinge of a door they had just discovered they could open. Federal analysts wanted time to extract the data. That meant waiting, which is a kind of sorrow in itself. It stretches the moment between discovery and understanding into a limbo where imagination begins to knit together possibilities. Daniel sat in the small interview room with Rex curled at his feet, his hands folded over a paper cup of cooling coffee. He let his fingers worry the edges of John's photograph twice, 3 times, the way a man fingers a rosary without remembering he's doing it. They called him in the late morning. The voice on the phone was efficient and small, precise, the kind of voice used to keep other people's hopes from spilling. "We've got a team in the lab. We need you to come up for a brief." Daniel drove without music. In the windows of midtown buildings, his reflection moved across glass as if it were someone else in the room. The lead agent met him at a nondescript entrance. Plain coat, badge inside the lapel, a tired face that had seen too many nights and had learned to keep saying, "We'll see," rather than, "We know." She did not smile. She did not have to. "We got an initial read," she said. "Not everything's out, but we have something you should see." They walked into a small room where a bank of screens threw cool light on faces. The cyber team was a quiet unit. 2 people at keyboards, 1 tallying metadata, 1 watching a rippling map overlay that pulsed with connection points. The forensic tech flipped a laptop. A directory opened. A single file was labeled simply Master. "That came off the drive?" Daniel asked. "Pulled from a container on the thumb drive," the tech replied. "Encrypted, but not deeply. Somebody didn't think the right people would ever look." He spoke like a man who had seen cleverness and then seen it fail against time and curiosity. "It's a mapping file. Names, numbers, routes, airport nodes, drop points. It references vendors, document makers, logistics. Some of the notations are shorthand, some are straight numerical accounts. There's overlap with name strings in John's file. Daniel looked at the screen. The map bloomed, dots and lines like constellations. Each line suggested motion. Each dot was a place where people passed without leaving much behind. He recognized some of the airports by the shape of the entry points. Others were more obscure. A series of names had been cross-referenced with passport numbers that matched entries pulled from the passports they had bagged. The lead agent pointed at one cluster. "See this pattern around transit hubs? These aren't random couriers. This looks like a network designed to move identity, fabricated papers, temporary persons, ways to make someone into someone else for a trip. It lines up with what was in the suitcase." "How deep?" Daniel asked. His voice felt oddly formal in a room of people who had been awake long enough to become clinical. "Deep enough for coordinated actions," she said. "We have names that recur. One of the recurring items matches a notation in John's notebook. Same shorthand. We pulled a photo from the drive that shows a man with a case similar to the one we stopped. Video frames from airports match the time codes. It's not prosecutorial yet. It's probable grounds for further warrants and coordinated takedowns." They handed Daniel a printout of the entry, and then a photograph of a corner of John's notebook. Nothing flashy, just a yellowing page caught at an angle. On it, in a hurried hand, a 3-word line stood out like a note pinned to a memory. "Follow the dog." Daniel read it twice. The words felt both like an order and a joke that life had played on him. He imagined John chuckling when he wrote it. Half code, half dare. If there was irony, it did not feel cruel. It felt like a kind of completion, a short circular moment where a dog had literally followed a suspicion home. The text cautioned about overinterpretation. "This file is a map, but it needs corroboration," the lead agent said. "We can pull warrants, but we need to move fast. If those nodes are active, they won't wait." They did not wait. A call went out, quiet at first, then like a ripple building into a wave. Task forces were notified. Teams that had chats in encrypted channels and spreadsheets with color-coded priorities rolled into action. It was the neater, colder machinery of investigation, exact in its purpose and indifferent to spectacle. Daniel watched it and felt both exultant and removed, like a soldier who'd seen a battle plan and realized he did not know where to stand. The plan was coordination across 3 cities. Banks of emails became lists of addresses. Legal teams drafted affidavits. The lead agent's voice, when she said, "Execute at dawn," was the voice of people who had rehearsed the phrase until it lost ordinary meaning. Daniel was told he could not be more than a witness in most of the raids, chain of custody and jurisdiction limits, but they wanted him close enough to advise about canine-sensitive evidence. Rex, of course, would ride to the nearest staging area. Daniel spent the night checking gear. He folded a clean uniform with the slow care of someone performing a ritual. He wrapped John's dog tag in a small cloth and put it into an evidence bag he could carry with him, officially as a placeholder for identification, privately as a piece of a man he'd missed. He sat in the squad room and watched analysts make lists and tie loops. At 3 a.m, he tried to sleep, and felt like a man with a foot at the edge of a cliff. He could feel the possibility of fall, but not its shape. Dawn arrived in a pale, thin wash. Teams moved with surgical synchronization. The first call to a midtown address was executed in silence and force. Tactics teams covered approaches, plainclothes officers moved into entry positions, and the coordinated knock became a cascade of doors opening with the quiet authority of warrants. Inside was the kind of room you'd expect if you mixed travel necessity and clandestine work. Clean surfaces, small safes, a wall lined with innocuous luggage, and a small bureau that when opened revealed a bank of materials. Stamps, blank pages, a press with a serial number filed away. A courier sat on a couch, eyes wide and knocked loose from sleep. At another location, in a rented storage unit outside the city, officers found packages of scent pads in vacuum-sealed rolls. Small cloths dense with chemical signatures meant to mask breath and confuse searches. The techs photographed everything and put on gloves with the calm of people who'd learned to make their hands speak the language of evidence. One of the raids found a small office space where someone had been operating a quiet cottage industry of documentation. Laminates, a light table, a careful notebooked ledger tied with a rubber band. Another found a courier safe house with lists of flights, times, and meeting points written in a shorthand that matched entries on the master file. At each place, the same dance occurred. Entry, securing of people, documentation, transport. Officers exercised care when encountering people who were plainly frightened and plainly not the architects of the system. The flow of interrogations separated operators from carriers, leaders from the small gears. A handful of individuals were detained for questioning. Several devices, hard drives, and stacks of documents were seized. One man in a tidy shirt lay his face in his hands and said, "I didn't know it was like that," which is a kind of sentence that invites investigation rather than resolution. Daniel watched the feeds from other teams on a phone propped on the dash of the van as the day lengthened. He felt the sharp, satisfying line of coordination. Swathes of work done by people willing to make their hours boring, so others would not have to live under fear. He felt also the sobering truth that uncovering a network does not equal closing a wound. It is the beginning of a long process of law, paperwork, testimony, and negotiated truth. Back at the lab, analysts worked on the drive's deeper containers. They parsed emails, cross-referenced phone metadata with transactions, and found payment flows that spoke to a transnational client list, payments to shell accounts, transfers routed through intermediary businesses. Again, the team was careful with language. "We have leads," the lead agent told Daniel. "We have probable cause. We have nodes to follow. But this is not a conviction. This is groundwork to ask courts for permission to step further." Daniel found himself in a room with the lead analyst, watching a series of photos sequenced like the frames of an evidence film. One image showed a man sliding a small gray suitcase onto a carousel, an almost ordinary gesture. But the metadata stamped a time that matched a transfer code on the master file. Another image showed a man who might be a handler in a public cafe exchanging a folded note with an older woman. It was the sort of ordinary choreography that made networks reliable. "What worries me," the analyst said, "is the redundancy. Whoever created this system accounted for inspection. They've got backup nodes and multiple couriers. If you knock one part down, the rest can reroute. We need the primary operators." "Can the primary operators be traced?" Daniel asked. "They can be traced," she said. "We have patterns, payment strings, a few phone numbers that recur but with burner rotation. We have vendors who will point to a middleman. We have, most importantly, John's notes showing the routes. That gives us a human map. People who worked that network knew John was on their trail. That's something." And then, a new document appeared on the screen. A video file pulled from a camera at a small international airport months before, where a man who looked like John had been following a lane of passengers. The time code was older. He wore his usual jacket. His jaw was set. He wasn't aware, in that clip, of the fate that would follow. Daniel felt the room tilt. For a second, the investigation became not only professional, but deeply personal. He thought of John's laugh at a training debrief, the way the man had scrawled route hints, and then vanished into a file that never closed. Watching that clip, Daniel felt closer and farther at once, close enough to see John's shoulders move, far enough that all he could do was watch a series of pixels. By evening, the raids had produced a pile of material enough to justify a new phase. The federal task force convened in a tight room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Lead agents compared notes. Lawyers prepared affidavits. The press would be contacted on a schedule. Families of missing persons had to be handled with care. It was an anatomy of bureaucracy, slow in its compassion and brisk in its necessity. Adrian, who had been taken from the airport as a suspicious courier, was called in for further questioning. He had been offered counsel. The precinct had assigned a liaison for his well-being as much as for procedure. Under questioning by federal agents, questions measured, careful, without spectacle, he began to tell more of the story. He spoke of being threatened, of people who had watched him like supervisors, of instructions passed via texts with one-word commands. He described being told never to look inside, and how he had been paid a sum that made his own rent bearable for a month. "There are parts I can't say," Adrian murmured at one point, the shape of his jaw like a man running against tides. "I was told if I opened the wrong thing, they'd hurt my family. I never saw the head of the operation. They kept things a layer away." He pointed in his way to the core of how those networks function: compartmentalization. He admitted to making drops, identifying people at trains, taking flight numbers. He named a few transit hubs and a recurring face that appeared in photographs distributed for payment. He refused to name anyone he could not place in front of him. His answers were not clean confessions. They were the fragments of a man trying to be honest while fearful. The thin, jagged stuff that investigators have to clean into something testable. Adrian's cooperation under duress allowed investigators to trace a handful of transactional paths. Several of the phone numbers he referenced emitted patterns that matched the master file. They found a middleman who had coordinated couriers through social media posts disguised as job offers for short-term travel support. The net began to narrow. The case was not tidy. The people at the top were invisible by design, but momentum amassed like snow behind a plow. It did not melt easily. One of the phone numbers led to a small office in a neighboring state where officers found a ledger with client initials and payment receipts. A search warrant there turned up a list of names that matched entries in John's notebook. Each new match felt like a small necessary victory. Throughout, Daniel kept the dog tag with him. At one point, when the day threatened to fold into the monotony of forms and pledges, he took John's kit out in the quiet of an evidence reading room. He opened the folded notebook, careful to keep the chain intact. There were road names, shorthand notes about times, and unusual pads, abbreviations that at first meant little, and then began to orient themselves into a narrative. There were not long indictments. There were small observations, train times, the make of a suitcase, a time someone had laughed too loudly on the phone. And there, in the middle of a page that looked impatient with bureaucracy, was the scrawl again: "Follow the dog." Daniel placed his thumb over the ink and felt the scratch of paper. He thought of Rex on the carousel, of the way the dog's jaw had determined a fate for a case that had been sleeping. He thought of the people who'd been moving through systems that reduced them to numbers and documents, and of John, a man who had perhaps noticed the same things and kept notes until the need to write outstripped the time to finish. "This is what got us here," Daniel said aloud to the empty room. He started the thread. There were human consequences to the next steps. Families wanted answers. The precinct's victim services teams made visits to people who'd been identified as possible victims or coerced couriers. Counselors and social workers sat at kitchen tables and made lists. The investigators moved through the legal steps. Affidavits submitted, warrants approved, evidence logged. The federal task force, now in possession of the master file, began to expand its focus beyond the initial nodes. The word network acquired flesh and address. 2 weeks later, in a coordinated operation that felt like the product of a long, patient loom being pulled tight, agents executed multiple warrants that targeted documentation factories and logistics nodes. In some places, surveillance footage had been collected for months to build a pattern. In others, fast action prevented nodes from relocating. At a single address in a suburban strip mall, unyielding in its ordinariness, agents found a room that had been used to manufacture identity packages. The wall had been papered with sample passports. Printers hummed. A man in his mid-40s, with a face that had once been kind, turned away from his computer when officers entered. He did not fight. He had expected this moment might come someday, he said later through counsel, but he thought it would be quieter. That quiet fit the reality of a large and hush-hushed operation. Another search led to a storage facility, where packages labeled only by numbers convened. Shipments waiting for a timetable. In a small apartment downtown, officers found a ledger of payees and a stack of stamped envelopes addressed to transit points. A man in a hoodie who answered to several nicknames tried to burn files when officers arrived. The fire failed in the face of efficient entry, and the evidence ended up in a tray. Across the cities, multiple people were taken into custody for questioning. Some were charged with document fraud. Others were held as material witnesses while the task force constructed broader indictments. Several couriers, when interviewed by victim services, said they had been coerced, recruited under false pretenses, and threatened when they attempted to leave. Those accounts required corroboration and careful handling, but they altered the moral landscape of the investigation from one of simple tradecraft to one of exploitation. Daniel watched the news cycle as stories about the investigation filtered into city morning programs and local papers. Headlines focused on the dramatic image, a police dog biting a suitcase that revealed a network. The angle was catchy, it sold well, but Daniel bristled at the way the story turned intricate, human suffering into a soundbite. He kept thinking of the small, scratched notebook and the man whose handwriting he'd been tracing, and of the dozens of people whose lives had been rearranged by a system that made erasure into a business. The federal task force, having amassed enough probable cause, began the long work of piecing together indictments. That work is not dramatic. It requires patience and a kind of moral thriftiness, making sure no thread is pulled without having the rest secured. The investigators prepared presentation packages, lined up witnesses, and coordinated with overseas partners where the trail went cold. The master file provided names and patterns. John's notebook provided the human intuition that guided them to the right nodes. At one point, Daniel was asked to appear at a small private meeting with John's family. They met in a quiet conference room at the precinct, the light steady and soft. John's sister, a woman with a face shaped by years of unanswered questions, sat across from Daniel and took his hands when he offered them the dog tag. "You found this," she said simply. "I did," Daniel answered. "We found things linked to his work. It's opening doors. I can't promise outcomes, only that people are working to follow through." She nodded, then reached into her bag and placed on the table a faded photograph of John and Shadow. Shoulder to shoulder, dogs and humans the same in their loyalty. Her eyes were wet, but she was leveled with the enormity of the day. "He liked following bad leads," she said with a thin smile. "You told me that once." Daniel laughed dryly, a small noise. "He said dogs tell truths machines miss," he replied. "Turns out he might have been right." They talked then about small things. The smell of Shadow's coat after a training day, the dinner John always skipped, the idiosyncratic way he annotated maps. Daniel left the meeting with John's sister quieter than he'd expected, not because the news was good, but because it was anchored. There was someone else besides the police who now had reason to hope and to watch. The task force recommended that Rex receive recognition for his role. The patrol sergeant filled out the form with a student's neatness. Dates, actions, acknowledgement of canine contribution. In a small ceremony at the precinct under fluorescent lights that made medals look austere, Rex got a folded commendation placed near his collar. Daniel felt the pride like a heat in his chest, but was careful to redirect praise to the team. He did what he was trained to do, he told anyone who asked, but he looked at Rex and saw something more. A companion who translated a world sense into an honest signal. The investigation did not end with the first round of raids. It never does in a neat arc. Instead, it became a series of investigations, each a chain. Follow a thread here, set another warrant there, wait for servers to cough up records, convince a judge you have probable cause, petition for extradition links, and so on. The master file was a map, but a map needs a traveler. The travel became the work of many people: cyber analysts, agents who spoke different languages, lawyers who drafted wiretaps, and social workers who sat with people who had been trafficked. Months passed in cycles of paperwork and courtroom dates and follow-ups. New warrants led to further discoveries. The task force built its investiture slowly, methodically. Every small seizure, every transcription, every corroborated witness added weight to cases that would eventually be filed in courtrooms with public defenders and prosecutors, and calendars that moved on their own long arcs. For Daniel, the months were both long and too short. There were nights he slept and nights he did not. There were mornings when he would sit in the squad room, watch a cup of coffee cool, and thumb John's photograph and think about the way the file had sat idle on a shelf for so long. He'd never believed in signs or omens. He believed in work, and in the stubbornness of people who will keep looking. One bright, cold morning, a small package arrived at the precinct addressed to Daniel in a neat, nondescript hand. Inside was a thin book of photos, shots John had taken during his work. No notes, no explanation, just images. Suitcases on carousels, faces in departure lounges, the back of a man who might have been a courier, a string of airport benches. Tucked between 2 pages was a slip of paper that read, in John's own hurried ink, "Keep looking." It was not a miracle. It was not a promise of closure. It was, like the dog tag, a small human thing, a baton passed along a track. Daniel folded the paper into his pocket and felt steadiness settle into him like a muscle learning new motion. By the time the task force was ready to present its first set of charges, the story had grown beyond a single suitcase. It had become an investigation that spanned airports, small offices, and storage units. It exposed an economy that had found ways to make identity portable, and sometimes anonymous. The indictment documents were long, careful, and sober. They listed charges and counts and had the kind of legal language that turns human lives into spreadsheets of alleged wrongdoing. Daniel scanned them and felt the gravity of everything contained in those pages. Publicly, the narrative settled into headlines that made the investigation feel conclusive, in ways legal processes are not. "Police dog exposes ring," read one morning's headline. The story made its round on morning shows. Commentators praised canine instincts and police diligence. Daniel watched the coverage and felt a mix of pride and an odd sense of distance. The public had a tidy image, but the real work was still in depositions, in interviews, in the slow unspooling of corroboration. Through it all, Daniel held to small rituals. He visited the memorial bench that had been placed in honor of John and Shadow in the training field. He sat with Rex at his feet and let the cold cut through his jacket. Once, he brought the dog tag and left it on the plaque for a moment, the metal gleaming like a small witness. He spoke aloud to the bench once after a long day of testimony and raids. "We found some of the pieces," he said, not sure he expected anyone or anything to answer. He got his answer the way the dead sometimes answer, in small human continuations. A woman from the missing persons unit sent him a message thanking him for his persistence. One of the couriers who had cooperated testified against a middleman. A small, decisive piece of testimony that earlier would not have existed now did. The task force moved forward. Months later, the precinct convened a small ceremony to honor team members across units. It was not flashy. A handful of officers, the canine handler team, the forensic techs, and a few federal agents shared coffee and recognition. Someone read a note from John's sister, thanking them for chasing a thread that had once been dismissed. Daniel felt the room gather around him and Rex, and the way a dog's action had reframed a cold file into a living consequence. In private, the thing that most stayed with Daniel was less about indictments, and more about the human smallness the case had revealed. He thought of Adrian, still under investigation, still tangled in choices he had made under threat. He thought of the couriers who were frightened and used, and of the people at the top whose anonymity had been part of the system's power. He wondered about the days when John had sat in cafes and annotated maps. He thought about the way a dog's jaw could close on a suitcase, and in that closing keep something small and honest from being lost. The case did not end with a dramatic courtroom moment. It ended in his mind, in the accumulation of many smaller ends. Warrants granted, files moved from cold to active, families with slightly clearer maps than they'd had before. The federal task force continued its work. Some people were charged, others remained under investigation. There were appeals to be heard in time. The promise of justice stretched forward like a sentence that still needed punctuation. One evening, long after the initial flurry, Daniel drove out to the training field with Rex. The field was trimmed and ordinary under late light, and the air smelled of cut grass and diesel. He sat on the bench where John's name had been affixed and thought about the strange chain of events. A dog's bite, a suitcase, a lab, a drive, a file that mapped a world, a family that had waited. He felt tired in a way that felt a little like gratitude. tired because the world had required stubbornness and they had delivered it. Rex lay his head on Daniel's knee and looked up with the blunt, honest gaze that had set a day in the terminal spinning into motion. Daniel rubbed the dog's ears, feeling the softness under the coarse fur, and thought of how little the dog understood of headlines and how much he understood of scent and routine and trust. "You did good," Daniel said, not to the public, not to cameras, but to a companion who had, in a single motion, translated attention into accountability. He took John's dog tag from his pocket and placed it on the bench between them. The metal hit the wood with a small click that felt like punctuation. He spoke then, quietly, the sort of sentence you say to close a chapter without pretending it is closed. "You followed it," he told the empty field. "You followed the dog." There were no fireworks, no exclamation. There was only a man, a dog, and a small piece of metal that had moved from one hand to another. For Daniel, that was enough to measure cause and effect. A trained nose, a handler's patience, and the slow machinery of law that could translate discovery into questions that might finally be answered. If this story moved you, share it with someone and tell us where you're watching from.